Truth.
In January 2024, something strange happened on National Route 4 in Burkina Faso. Drivers slowed down, not because of traffic, but because of disbelief. A toll station had appeared overnight in Bhutena. 6 lanes, digital payment, glass windows, not a temporary shack, a real facility. There were no billboards, no aid agency ribbon cuttings, no foreign contractor logos, just concrete, steel, and silence. 2 weeks later, another station opened in Tintaloo, then a third in Cotodougou. Suddenly, a toll network was forming, linked, functional, and unprecedented. The country was under sanctions, facing trade restrictions, excluded from international development conversations. And yet it was building. No IMF, no World Bank, no external consultants. Every part of it, from the cement to the software, sourced locally, not borrowed, not donated. Built, it went against everything the textbooks say about how infrastructure works in Africa. No white papers, no feasibility summits, just action. Because for decades, roads like these came with strings. Loans, conditions, consultants flown in from cities that couldn't pronounce the village names. But this wasn't debt. It was a signal, a quiet declaration that something had shifted. Burkina Faso was no longer asking for permission to move forward, and maybe the most powerful part, no one announced it. These toll booths didn't trend on Twitter. They didn't make the evening news in Brussels. But to the people driving through them each morning, they meant one thing: we've started collecting our future. Like if this challenges what you thought you knew about development. Share if this deserves to be seen beyond the region. And subscribe if you're tired of stories that only get told when outsiders write them. Just outside Bhutena, on a road more used to dust than development, something appeared suddenly, quietly, and without permission. No ceremony, no photo op, just 6 lanes, a glass-paneled toll station, and a small digital scanner blinking to life like it had always belonged there. Drivers slowed down, not because of traffic, but because their eyes couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. It didn't match the headlines. Not in a country under sanctions, not in a region still called fragile by the same institutions that forgot to ask what people here were capable of. But there it stood, and it worked. Receipts printed, gates lifted. Staff reported for duty and came back the next day. Not for show, not for a summit, for real. That was the shock. Not that something was built, but that it functioned. Because for decades, roads in this region followed a script everyone had come to expect. Big promises, bigger delays, then nothing. Maybe a ribbon, maybe a sign, but rarely pavement that lasted through a season. Toll booths. If they existed, they were concrete boxes with one tired man, a cash jar, and never enough change. But this one was different. It beeped, it tracked, it counted in real time, and the sign above said it plainly. Post de page de Bhutena, no donor logos, no flags from partner nations. Just a name, and a country quietly declaring, we did this ourselves. That's what stood out. Not just what was present, but what was missing. No debt from Paris. No oversight from Washington. No consultant flying in from Brussels to assess feasibility. Just one country, under pressure, choosing to build anyway. The reaction wasn't choreographed. There was no campaign, no press run. Only questions, real ones, whispered between drivers headed in from Ouagadougou. If they can do this here, what else are they already doing? And then came the answer, not in words, in repetition. 2 more toll stations opened in the following weeks, one in Tintalou, another in Cotodougou. Same layout, same software, same quiet certainty. No hashtags, no parades, just movement. In a place where infrastructure once meant endless waitlists and forgotten plans. This felt fast, almost too fast, and that raised a deeper question. How did a country once told to wait suddenly outrun those who always had a head start? The answer isn't in the concrete. It isn't in the scanner. It's in the shift. The choice to build without permission, without applause, without asking anyone but themselves. And that choice, it's going to change the game. No foreign banks. No international grants. No waiting for approvals from offices thousands of miles away. Just a road fund, run by Burkina hands, and it paid for everything. The stations weren't decorative. They weren't pilot projects. They were infrastructure, fully functional, fully national, and the budget behind them came from an agency most people had never heard of, Le Fonds Spatial Routier du Burkina Faso. Every receipt printed at Bhutena, Tintalou, or Cotodougou. Every single transaction fed straight back into that same fund, and then into more asphalt, more repairs, more kilometers holding under the weight of belief. For once, the cycle didn't leave the country. The money stayed. And with it came something that had always gone missing: responsibility. No more waiting on donor disbursements delayed by political reviews. No more tweaking local needs to fit someone else's procurement template. No quarterly reports written in the tone of apology. But that kind of ownership, it doesn't come free. It comes with pressure, the kind that doesn't let you hide. Because when a pothole reopens, there's no hotline to Brussels. When a toll booth printer fails, no consultant is flying in to fix it. When something breaks, it's your name on the receipt. And maybe that's why it worked. Drivers like Musa noticed the shift before the papers did. He used to spend half his journey dodging craters, and the other half paying to avoid fines that weren't real. Now, he pays one fee, gets a receipt, the road holds, and the checkpoints wave him through. It's weird, he told a reporter. I thought it would break, but it hasn't. That line stuck, because it wasn't just about the pavement. It was about trust, and how it grows in places where promises used to vanish. People didn't believe in the system right away. But when receipts printed and the asphalt didn't crack, even the skeptics started to slow down, started to notice. So what changed? Maybe it wasn't just the budget. Maybe it was the math. A booth that collects without leaking. A fund that pays its own bills. A system that doesn't overspend. Just outlasts. Burkina Faso wasn't building what it could afford. It was building what it could manage. And that's a different kind of development entirely. Which raises a bigger question. If it works here, under sanctions, with no aid cushion, What does that say about countries still caught in loan cycles they didn't design? Drop a thought in the comments. Should more African nations take this path, fund locally, build quietly? Or is Burkina Faso just the outlier that proves the rule? Either way, one thing's clear: somebody else is watching. Because by the time the third toll booth went live, satellite images showed new clearings on the southern corridor, and on one of them, the markings looked suspiciously like lane foundations. A few weeks after the third toll station went live, something unexpected happened. Not another speech, not another ribbon, just asphalt moving. But not for repairs, for export. Trucks began leaving local production sites across Burkina Faso, carrying fresh, high-grade asphalt, not headed for remote villages or long-delayed ring roads. They were crossing borders, into Niger, into Mali, even toward ports in Côte d'Ivoire bound for clients outside the continent. No headlines, no aid agency logos, just a product, clean, consistent, and quietly efficient. This wasn't a road project anymore. It was industry. Burkina Faso, once boxed in by geography, sanctions, and the perception of fragility, had turned inward pressure into outward capacity. And now, the same country that used to borrow for infrastructure was supplying materials for the very projects it once couldn't afford. It didn't take long for Europe to notice, not through politicians, but through procurement teams, because asphalt isn't ideological. It doesn't carry a flag, it just gets poured. And when it's cheaper, cleaner, and doesn't cross 5 customs zones, it gets bought. That's when the real questions started. Not just, how are they building this? But who's funding it? And more quietly, who's losing market share because of it? For decades, the model was simple. Countries like Burkina Faso imported infrastructure. They didn't export it. But this model didn't come with theory. It came with invoices, signed contracts, delivery receipts. For Burkinabe engineers, it wasn't just progress. It was proof that they weren't just catching up, they were supplying the race. For neighboring nations, it offered a new choice, one that didn't involve loans, conditions, or project managers flying in to explain how asphalt works in 110 degrees F heat. But for some overseas contractors, the ones who'd built careers on predictable dependencies, this wasn't a success story. It was a red flag, because if one country, small, sanctioned, landlocked, can build a toll network, fund it internally, export materials, and bypass debt, what stops the others? What began as a quiet station on Route 4 was suddenly a crack in the global playbook. And from that moment on, the pressure wouldn't just be domestic. There was no embargo, no official notice, no headlines declaring a shift in policy. But suddenly, payments got delayed, parts got held at ports, and some software updates just stopped arriving. Burkina Faso never got a letter, but the message came through line by line, click by click, invoice by invoice. After the road fund proved too efficient, after asphalt started crossing borders, friction began showing up in the fine print. Shipping insurance premiums quietly rose, marked as unusual risk. European software firms paused support, citing internal policy reviews. Bank wires, legal documented, contract-backed, were flagged red under compliance checks. This wasn't a blockade. It was a slowdown, designed not to punish, just to exhaust. The logic was simple: you're free to build, but only if it doesn't outperform anyone else. For those inside the road fund, this wasn't theory. It was logistics. One manager said he waited 2 extra weeks for road sensors. Already paid for, already shipped, held without explanation. Another engineer opened his dashboard one morning and found the monitoring system gone. Access revoked after a back-end update, still under contract, still billed. No one called it a sanction, but everyone recognized the feeling. And yet they didn't stop. They adapted. Imported parts were replaced with locally machined components. Sensor systems backed up manually. New modules developed offline, not as upgrades, but as contingency plans turned permanent. Because the irony was sharp. The more the system was slowed from the outside, the faster it evolved from within. What started as punishment became practice, and the tools they once depended on, cloud services, foreign firmware, outsourced diagnostics, were now replicated, simplified, owned. So here's the quiet twist. The pressure didn't weaken the model. It made it stronger. By trying to slow them down, the world taught them something they hadn't learned in decades of technical assistance. That sovereignty isn't just the freedom to build when allowed. It's the resilience to keep building when someone tries to quietly stop you. And that kind of resilience, it doesn't stay local, it spreads. The next capital to notice what was happening wouldn't be one giving out loans, but one quietly asking, how did they pull this off? 1 year after Butena's first toll booth lit up, delegations started showing up. No flags, no cameras, just quiet groups from Bamako, from Lomé, from Abidjan, walking the lanes with engineers, finance officers, and notebooks in hand. They weren't there for ceremonies. They were there for answers. How did this work without loans? The interest wasn't political. It was practical. Each of those 9 countries, all quietly represented, were sitting on some combination of loan fatigue, unfinished roads, and publics growing tired of ribbon cuttings without results. So when they saw the Bhutena toll booth still working, printing receipts, tracking vehicles, and supporting roads that didn't collapse at the first rain, they didn't ask for white papers. They asked for templates. Some borrowed the code. Others asked for funding blueprints. One unnamed country requested access to back-end specs for the toll system. Another rewrote national legislation within 3 weeks, mirroring Burkina's road fund, almost line for line. What once looked like a local experiment suddenly started reading like a regional prototype, and the institutions watching it all, they didn't clap, they started sweating. A leaked policy memo from a European development bank didn't name names, but the warning was clear. Emerging alternatives to traditional infrastructure finance present reputational risk, especially if adopted before governance controls are aligned. Translation: if this catches on, the old model, the donor-led, consultant-managed, debt-heavy model, stops being the default, and the risk wasn't just about economics. It was about the story. Because if 9 countries can build and maintain toll infrastructure. With local capital, local labor, and public trust. What does that say about the last 30 years of development expertise? Now will every copy work? No, some will stumble on corruption. Others might scale too fast with systems not ready for pressure. But the shift is real, and it's already in motion. Burkina Faso lit the match. But the fire isn't theirs to contain anymore. What comes next isn't replication. It's pressure. Pressure on the old model to justify itself. Pressure on governments to prove why they still need to ask before building. Pressure on global institutions to explain what happens when the global south figures out how to move without them. In 2024, two West African countries tried to follow Burkina Faso's lead. They weren't staging protests. They weren't calling for revolution. They were simply setting up toll systems, public, state-owned, and funded with their own money. And that's when the classification changed. Not by rebels, not by hackers, by banks, within weeks of announcing their intent to replicate the model. Both nations were quietly downgraded by international risk agencies. No press conference, no hearings, just a new line in a PDF. Infrastructure, fragility, risk. And with that phrase, everything shifted. Import licenses slowed without explanation. Bond rates jumped. Insurers backed out of road projects, citing exposure beyond acceptable thresholds. But here's what no one could explain. Neither country had defaulted. Neither had missed a payment. They hadn't changed leadership, abandoned commitments, or rewritten rules. Their only trigger, trying to build without IMF alignment, trying to fund without foreign oversight, trying to move alone. So what was labeled as fragility was actually financial independence. In Senegal, procurement documents showed a freeze order, issued just 3 days after their delegation visited Ouagadougou's road fund. In Guinea, a shipment of road scanners went missing in paperwork. Twice. It arrived 4 months late. But not broken, just slowed. On paper, the pattern was subtle. In reality, it was loud. Act local, risk isolation. Skip consultants, risk downgrade. Ask no one. Risk punishment without trial. But here's what happened next. And it didn't follow any forecast. Tech teams didn't fold. They went inward. Instead of cancelling plans, they took the blueprints they saw in Burkina and started coding, welding, wiring from scratch. Where parts didn't arrive, they sourced locally. Where delays hit, 3 regions pooled inventories to finish on time. One senior engineer in Conakry put it simply, if they call it fragility now, wait till they see resilience. Because while credit scores fell, public trust rose, receipts printed, potholes got patched, drivers stopped bribing and started driving, and every toll paid became a statement, not just about funding, but about control. What began as a downgrade became a stress test, and what passed through that test wasn't just a road, it was a mindset. If this story flips what you thought you knew, about risk, about aid, about who gets to build, hit like, tap subscribe, and send this to someone still waiting for permission because the pressure's mounting, but the road ahead, still under construction. By choice, not by consent. In early 2025, Two ministers from neighboring countries stood before cameras and dismissed Burkina Faso's toll model. They called it unsustainable populism, an experiment with no future, a headline, not a system. What they didn't mention, just a few months earlier, both governments had quietly requested access to Burkina's back-end toll specs. One had even drafted legislation mirroring the road fund's operational design. That's not contradiction, that's containment, because what threatens power more than failure is a working alternative, and this model worked. The backlash didn't stop at podiums. A leaked email from a regional infrastructure summit revealed deeper conversations. Not about the tech, but about the narrative. Senior officials debated how to reframe Burkina's model as a threat to regional policy norms. No names, no open accusations, just a single line that said it all. Avoid legitimizing projects that lack multilateral oversight. Translation: if we don't control it, we can't let it succeed too loudly. Why now? Why the urgency? Because for decades, underperformance had an excuse. No donors, no roads. No consultants, no contracts. No permission, no progress. But suddenly that equation cracked, and people noticed. In Bamako, posters appeared overnight. One side showed a bridge stalled mid-construction. The other, a functioning Burkina toll booth with a digital receipt taped next to it. In Accra, radio hosts started asking questions that didn't follow party lines. Why can't we run our own tolls again? The narrative was moving, not because it was endorsed, but because it couldn't be contained. So the pushback shifted, not against the roads, against the messenger. Words like military regime, unverified figures, populist optics began replacing actual data, replacing real questions. Because when a model works, and no one wants to admit it, you don't argue with its results, you attack the context. But here's the problem: people don't live in contexts, they live in consequences. And when the tomato truck arrives on time, when a school bus doesn't break down, when a driver gets a receipt instead of being asked for extra, no one cares about policy memos or power plays. Because once people see a system that works, they stop asking who built it and start asking why no one else did. That question, no headline can hold it. What comes next isn't about toll booths anymore. It's not about infrastructure. It's about the right to redefine what's possible without asking first. And that story is just getting started. By mid-2025, three quiet words began surfacing in reports across West Africa. Burkina Model replication. Not from design firms, not from multilateral task forces, but from drivers, from small-town mayors, from farmers who used to factor bribes into their market trips. Because once receipts start printing, excuses stop circulating. What once felt like Burkina's exception now looked less like luck and more like a blueprint. But this wasn't just a system, it was a filter. Everywhere it was quietly tested, from dusty checkpoints outside Bamako to river crossings in Niger. Results came fast, bribes disappeared, delays shortened, and revenue tracked vehicle by vehicle, transaction by transaction. But something else surfaced, quieter than scandal, louder than reform, Officials who used to pocket extras stepped back, middlemen lost leverage, and the weak links in the system, they didn't need to be exposed. They just became visible. Because the system didn't shout, it just functioned. One mayor put it simply: before we had to catch the theft, now we just count the receipts. And that's the shift. Not building around corruption, building through it, not punishing theft. Rendering it obsolete. No arrests. No new task forces. Just tools that made exploitation unprofitable and unnecessary. From Mali to Niger, small pilots are already active, not with press releases, not with donor flags. Just toll booths, basic tech, and something rare, transparency without performance theater. It's not loud, it's not viral, but it spreads, because nothing moves faster than proof that works. And once that proof becomes public, the story stops being about roads. It becomes about who dares to follow them. If you've ever been told that real change has to wait, that systems are too broken to fix, or that your country isn't ready, then remember this. Sometimes it only takes one working receipt to unravel a decade of excuses. Like, if that resonates, comment if you've seen it happen, and share this story. Not because it's perfect, but because it's possible. The Burkina model isn't a miracle, it's a mirror, and now the reflection is spreading.